I never gave much importance to the attic of my house. It's one of those small spaces, with access through a hatch in the corridor, which requires a staircase to enter. I never kept anything upstairs, so I rarely thought about him. But on a Tuesday night, around 9:30, while watching TV in the living room, I started to hear a strange sound. At first, I thought it was the wind hitting something, but I realized it was different. It was rhythmic. Steps. Slow, heavy, one at a time, as if someone was walking from one side to the other up there. I sat, trying to rationalize. Maybe it was an animal, a raccoon or something like that. But the more I heard, the more I realized that the sound was very similar to human steps. Each click of the floor came with an exact interval, and always in the same region of the attic. I took my cell phone and recorded a few seconds to make sure I wasn't imagining. The recording made it clear. There was something or someone walking up there. I took a flashlight and stood still in the hallway, looking at the door on the ceiling. The sound continued exactly above me, as if the person, or whatever it was, knew I was down there. I didn't have any ladder that reached that height, and honestly, I didn't have the courage to improvise. I called a friend who lives nearby, trying to disguise the tension in his voice, and asked him to come here. While I was waiting, I remained there, standing still, with the flashlight pointing up, and the feeling was that every second the weight of those steps became clearer. After a few minutes, the noise suddenly stopped. An absolute silence took over the house. I didn't know if this was good or bad because along with the silence came a suffocating feeling of being watched, even without seeing anything. I kept staring at the hatch when I heard a dry sound, like something small falling to the floor. I looked and saw, in the middle of the corridor, a rusty nail, which certainly wasn't there before. He was hot to the touch, as if he had just let go of something. My friend arrived a few minutes later, and when I told him what was happening, he tried to act naturally, but I realized that he was uncomfortable. We took the small staircase from the garage and went up as much as we could to open the door. The smell that came from up there was strange, a mixture of old dust and something metallic. We threw the flashlight light, but we only saw old boxes and spider webs. Still, the feeling that there was someone there didn't even pass for a second. We decided to close again and leave it to look calmly in the morning. But the moment we were going down the stairs, we heard quick steps, as if something crossed the attic from end to end. We stopped, looked at each other and stood still, trying to listen better. There was no time to react. Again an object fell, but now it was a small key, which hit the floor and slid until it stopped right in front of my feet. We stood still, looking at that key on the floor as if it were the most threatening thing in the world. None of us bent down to catch her. My friend, trying to break the mood, asked if it was from any door of the house, but I had never seen that key before. The shape was old, dark iron, like something that would open an old padlock or an old closet. The detail that bothered me the most is that she was warm, as if she had been held by someone until a few seconds ago. We went down the stairs without saying anything and locked the attic door. The night was long. Every click of the house seemed louder than usual. Around 3 in the morning, I woke up with the clear feeling that there was someone walking up there again. I didn't hear footsteps this time, but a low metallic sound, as if the key was being turned in some lock. I was still sweating until everything suddenly stopped. I never found the courage to open the attic since that night. That week I was alone at home because my parents had traveled to visit my grandparents. It was early at night, and I was on the couch watching TV when the landline rang. I found it strange because almost no one cares about the landline nowadays. When I looked at the caller ID, I felt a chill. It was my very house number. I answered slowly, trying to think if it could be some kind of operator error. I didn't hear any voice, just a slow breath very close to the phone. I was silent for a few seconds, waiting for the person to speak, but all that came next was the clear sound of footsteps on the wooden floor. I recognized that sound immediately. It was the same as what I heard when someone walked in the upstairs hallway. The call dropped suddenly, no click, no goodbye. I ran up to check, but the house was completely empty, and all the doors and windows closed. I already went off with that feeling that something was not right, trying to convince myself that it was some kind of interference on the line. I sat on the couch again, but I kept looking at the phone, kind of waiting for it to ring again. It didn't even take 5 minutes, and the identifier showed my own number again. I already took it with my hands sweating. This time, the breath was heavier, as if the person was panting. Again the steps came, but now they seemed slower, as if whoever it was approaching something, or me. The call dropped the same moment I heard a metallic sound, as if it were a handle being moved. I got up in an impulse and went to the front door, but there was no one outside. When I returned to the living room, the phone rang for the third time. But before I could answer, he stopped and the silence became even more suffocating. It was at that moment that I realized something that froze me. The phone was off the hook since the last call, but it had still rung. I couldn't understand how that was possible, and the only thing I wanted at that moment was for my parents to come back soon. I decided to go to the corridor to check if I hadn't left any light on. On the way, I passed in front of the entrance mirror and for a moment, I had the impression of seeing a shadow moving behind me. I came quickly, but the house was empty and silent. The landline was still off the hook, but when I looked at it, the call light blinked by itself, as if someone was trying to dial from inside. A chill went up the back of my neck, and I began to wonder if I was going crazy, or if there really was someone inside the house. I took my cell phone and dialed the landline number, just to see what happened. Instead of calling, I immediately heard a service click and that breath coming back, closer, sharper. I didn't say anything, I just kept listening. The steps came back, but this time the sound was familiar. It seemed to come from the corridor, exactly where I was. I put down the phone and stepped back, trying to control the panic, but without the courage to go up or check each room. I ran to the kitchen and took the sharpest knife I found. I tried to think rationally, telling myself that it could be some kind of interference or problem on the line, but nothing explained the steps synchronized with the sound of the phone. They suddenly stood, as if whoever it was knew exactly what I was paying attention to. Then, a metallic noise echoed from the room, as if something heavy had been knocked down. The air seemed colder and heavier, and every muscle in my body was tense. I decided not to investigate alone, and dialed 911. While the attendant asked what was happening, I heard, right in the background of the call, that same breath that came from the landline, as if it was being picked up by my cell phone. The blood froze in my veins. I looked at the corridor and saw, for a second, a shadow projected on the wall, high, motionless, facing me. I blinked, and she was no longer there. The police arrived a few minutes later, but found nothing. Until today, I never answered the landline at night again. I was driving alone back home, already around midnight, on a secondary highway that cuts through a rural area. The radio was low just to keep me awake, and the road went straight for long stretches, without many poles. The asphalt was wet because of a fine drizzle, so I kept constant speed and safe distance. That's when I saw, at the edge of the lighthouse, a figure standing on the side of the road, exactly facing the track. He didn't make a sign, he didn't move his arm, he didn't lean, he just stood up, stiff. The face was in the shadow of the hood or the angle itself, hard to say, and that froze me immediately. I passed by her and, by reflex, looked in the rearview mirror, hoping to see some movement. Nothing moved, only the motionless silhouette falling behind, the same way it appeared. I tried to convince myself that it was someone waiting for a ride, but the time and the stretch didn't match. There was no wide shoulder, no stopped car, no lighting, only open field on both sides. I increased the speed a little, more to get out of that window feeling than in a hurry. About 5 minutes later, the road made a long turn and went straight again for a good stretch. And that's when my stomach turned. The same figure was in front, on the same side, in the same posture. Identical, motionless, looking in the direction of my car as if I had never left the place. There were no detours, side streets, or walkways. To get there, you would have to have run in the dark. I didn't honk, I didn't stop, I just reduced a little and passed by keeping the steering wheel firm, feeling the hands sweat. I kept keeping my eyes fixed on the road, but I couldn't resist and looked in the rearview mirror again. This time, for a fraction of a second, I had the impression that the figure's head turned around, accompanying my car. I don't know if it was real or something of my already nervous mind, but it gave me such a strong chill that even the back of my neck hurt. I kept driving, trying to think of explanations. Maybe they were two different people, with the same clothes, going somewhere. But it didn't make sense. There were no houses, bars, or bus stops on that stretch. The road there is isolated, and throughout the route I did not cross with any other vehicle. With each kilometer, the feeling that there was something wrong with it only increased. The silence inside the car seemed heavier than the engine noise itself. When I arrived at a more illuminated stretch, near an intersection, I thought I would finally be calm. But as I approached, I realized that there was something dark on the curb, almost on the crosswalk. My headlights revealed the same figure, still, motionless, as if it were waiting for me to pass. My heart was already racing, and for a moment I thought about braking and confronting, just to end that anguish. But fear spoke louder, and fear was logical. If that was a real person, the behavior was too abnormal for me to approach. I went straight, trying not to stare directly, but with the peripheral vision I realized that he didn't move even an inch. It was as if I was frozen in time. I kept accelerating, but I couldn't help but look through the rearview mirror. The figure was still there, standing, looking in my direction, until it disappeared into the dark. I tried to convince myself that when I got home, everything would seem less scary, as it happens with some night fears. But about 10 minutes before I left the road, I saw a movement ahead, near a deactivated station. My headlights completely illuminated the empty courtyard, and there was again the same silhouette, standing, at exactly the same angle as before. I can't explain how it would be possible for someone to get there so quickly. It was physically impossible without a car, and there was no other vehicle on the road. The feeling this time was that no matter how far I walked, it could appear at any point on the way. I entered the city almost running, with sweaty hands sticking to the steering wheel. The streets were busier, but the tension didn't pass. When I arrived at the garage, I stayed a few minutes inside the car, taking a deep breath, just trying to assimilate what had happened. The figure didn't appear again, but the road seemed longer and more suffocating than ever that night. To this day, I avoid going through that stretch after the sun goes down. And honestly, I don't know what scares me more, the possibility of having seen a person with strange intentions, or something that wasn't human. I woke up early that morning as usual, still a little groggy, and with the dim light of dawn entering through the curtain slip. I went to the kitchen thinking only of making a coffee, but something caught my attention before I even got there, a breath of cold air coming from the living room. When I turned the corridor, I realized that the front door was ajar. Not only unlocked, but open enough to show part of the street. My stomach gave an instant knot. I was absolutely sure that I had locked the door the night before. I always do that. It's almost a ritual before bed, checking locks and windows, out of pure habit. I stood there, looking at the deserted street, trying to process what I was seeing. There were no signs of burglary, the lock was intact, and it didn't look like anyone had forced the door. For a moment, I thought maybe I had forgotten to lock it. But no. I clearly remembered turning the key, pulling the door to check, and listening to the click of the latch. When I closed it, I noticed another strange detail. The corridor carpet was slightly turned to the side, as if someone had stumbled or dragged their foot while passing. I looked up slowly, sweeping the room with my eyes, trying to notice anything out of place. That's when I realized the picture frame on the bookshelf, the one with the photo of my family at Christmas, was facing down. I would never leave him like this. I walked cautiously, my heart racing, feeling a growing discomfort with every step. I passed through the living room and got to the kitchen. The chairs on the table were slightly away, as if someone had sat there recently. There were no plates, glasses, or any leftover food, but the simple idea that someone could have been there while I slept made me sweat cold. My first instinct was to check the rooms. I went up the stairs slowly, trying to hear any noise. Nothing. The silence was so heavy that it seemed to amplify the sound of my own breathing. I entered my room first, and everything seemed normal, until I noticed that the curtain was a little more open than I usually leave. I went to the window and noticed a very soft hand mark on the glass, as if it had been left by someone outside. The detail that scared me the most? She was at the exact height of my eyes. Seeing that mark left me paralyzed for a few seconds. There were no signs of dirt around, just that almost perfect impression, as if it had been made recently. I looked at the backyard, but I didn't see anything abnormal. Even so, I had the strange feeling that, if I kept looking, I could see someone moving in the shadows. I closed the curtain tightly, and went to check the guest room, which is rarely used. The bed was made, but the closet door was ajar. I'm absolutely sure that I always leave that closet closed. I approached, trying to control my breathing, and opened the door carefully. Inside, everything seemed to be in order, except for one detail. The coat I usually keep at the bottom was hanging right in front, as if it had been placed there recently. I felt a chill go up my spine. It wasn't possible that I had done that. I went down again, this time determined to check all the locks, and that's when I noticed another disturbing detail. The back door key, which I usually leave on the bench, was no longer there. I ran to the back door, and it was locked inside. I scrubbed the kitchen, the hallway, even the bathroom, but the key didn't appear. I kept trying to remember if, for some reason, I could have moved it the day before, but it didn't make sense. That's when I heard a dry sound coming from upstairs, as if something had fallen on the floor of the master bedroom. I went up slowly, trying not to make noise, and pushed the door carefully. I didn't see anything out of place, until I realized that the cell phone that was charging in the outlet next to the bed was no longer there. Panic began to take over, and I ran to get my spare phone that I keep in the kitchen drawer. When I unlocked it, I realized that there was a new photo in the gallery. It was from my room, taken from a low angle, as if someone had crouched next to the door. In the image, you could see myself sleeping. I don't remember hearing anything during the night, and to this day, I have no idea who entered my house without taking anything except my peace. That night, I had been awake for a while, turning from one side to the other in bed, when I first noticed the flash crossing the bedroom curtain. It was the sensor light in the backyard. It only turned on when someone passed by, so my first thought was that it was some cat or even a skunk, since it rained the day before and the smell of earth was strong. I got up, went to the kitchen window, and looked for a few seconds, but I didn't see anything. The light went out by itself, and I went back to the room, trying not to worry. About 15 minutes later, the light came on again. This time, I stood still on the bed, just watching the light change every second through the door slit. I felt that cold in my stomach, as if something was wrong, and I went to the kitchen again. No movement. The wet earth near the wall was intact, at least that's what I thought at first glance. I decided to ignore it, and went back to bed, but sleep was already gone. I lay down, but with my ear attentive. It didn't take long for the flash to cross the curtain once again. I got up, but this time I didn't turn on any lights inside the house, so as not to report me. I slowly approached the window and tried to see through the glass, but it was blurry because of the humidity. I opened it just a little bit to have a better view, and then I noticed something strange. There were marks on the earth that weren't there before, as if they were footprints, but they weren't of animals. They were shoes, well defined, pointing to my house. My heart started racing. I stood still for a few seconds, trying to hear any sound other than my own breathing. There were no steps, no wind, no noise of leaves. Just the light on illuminating those marks on the floor, as if I were pointing exactly where I should look. I closed the window, stepped back and leaned against the wall, trying to think about what to do. The light went out again, and the backyard returned to complete darkness. I took my cell phone and turned on the camera, using the zoom to try to capture something from the room. I waited a few more minutes until the light turned on again, but this time, no shadow passed, no movement was noticeable. Only the footprints that seemed a little closer, as if someone had come closer to the house. I felt a cold run down my spine, and I had the feeling that, if I continued there, I would see something I didn't want to see. I thought about calling the police, but how do I explain that someone turned on my movement light and left marks in the backyard without me seeing the person? I decided to lock all the doors and windows again, checking one by one. I went back to the room and tried to sleep, but with every snarl of the house, my whole body stiffened. The next day when I left for work, I looked at the backyard again. The marks were there, but now they came and went, as if someone had gone around several times during the night. For the rest of the day, that image of the footprints didn't leave my head. They were large, probably from an adult man, and seemed very recent, since the earth was still slightly wet from the serene dawn. The most disturbing thing is that they seemed to stop right in front of the kitchen window, as if the person had stood there, just watching. I tried to convince myself that it could be some curious neighbor, or even a lost delivery man, but the pattern and the time when it all happened didn't make sense. The next night, I decided to install an improvised camera with my old cell phone, pointing to the backyard. I programmed it to record as soon as the light turned on. I slept badly, waking up from time to check. Around 3 a.m., I was woken up by the flash of light entering through the curtain. I looked at the cell phone screen, and for a few seconds I saw only the empty backyard, until a high, still shadow appeared right on the edge of the frame without moving. The video was cut soon after. I got up slowly, trying not to make noise, and went to the kitchen window. The sensor light was still on, illuminating a part of the backyard, but there was no one in sight. The detail that scared me the most was realizing that the side gate was a half open, when I was absolutely sure that I had locked it with the padlock before going to sleep. The wind couldn't open like that, and the padlock was still stuck, but barely fitted, as if it had been put back in a hurry. I spent the rest of the night on the couch, with the internal lights on and the phone in hand, ready to call the police if something else happened. When the day dawned, I went to check out the backyard. In addition to the shoe marks from the previous night, there were now lighter footprints, as if the person had taken a few steps through the lawn before leaving through the side gate. and again they ended up facing the kitchen window. I was alone at home that night, trying to relax after a busy day at work. The TV was on, showing some program, but my attention was on my cell phone. That's when it vibrated, and I saw a message from an unknown number. "You just turned off the TV." By reflex, I looked at the TV, and only then did I realize that it had really turned it off by itself. I didn't think it was a big deal. I figured it could be some electrical problem, or even I touched the control without realizing it, but that message made me uncomfortable. Before I could answer, another message arrived. "Now you're looking at your cell phone." I felt a chill run down my spine. I thought about who could be playing a trick on me. Friends? Neighbors? But the detail is that my curtain was closed, and the only way to see myself in there would be to be very close to my house. I got up slowly, trying to make as little noise as possible, and went to the window. I pulled the curtain just enough to peek. The street was empty, only the yellowish light of the pole illuminating the wet asphalt by the fine drizzle. I tried not to panic, but my hands were already sweating. I blocked the number, thinking it would solve it, and went to the kitchen to drink a glass of water. I was still in the hallway when the cell phone vibrated again, but now with a different number. "Now you're in the hallway." I was paralyzed, holding the glass so hard that I thought I was going to spill it. I looked quickly at the front door and the windows, trying to reason from where this person could be seeing me. The lights were on in all the rooms I had passed through, and this made me realize how exposed I was. With my heart racing, I went to the door to check the lock. I was still locked up, but a horrible feeling dominated me. What if the person was already inside the house? I ran to the room and took a small flashlight that I kept in the bedside drawer. I started searching each room, opening closets, looking behind the doors, even under the bed. No sound, no sign of invasion. But when I returned to the living room, another SMS arrived. "You just looked behind the kitchen door." This confirmed that the person knew exactly what I was doing, in real time. I ran to the front window and pulled the curtain at once, hoping to see someone in the backyard or across the street. But it was completely empty, only the lamppost illuminating a piece of the sidewalk. This absence of movement only made everything more suffocating. I decided to call the police, but even before unlocking the cell phone, another message arrived. "It's no use calling." It was at that moment that I felt my throat dry up. The feeling of being watched was so intense that it seemed that my eyes couldn't focus on anything, as if someone was everywhere at the same time. The police operator answered quickly, and I explained the situation with a trembling voice. They promised to send a car immediately. While I was waiting, I sat in the living room trying to keep all the windows in my field of vision. The phone vibrated again. "You're looking for me." This time, I didn't answer, I just turned off the device and put it on the floor. When the vehicle arrived, they searched the area, said there was no sign of invasion, and instructed me to install cameras. But until today, I never found out who sent me those messages, or how they knew exactly every move I made that night. I was already getting angry, and at the same time worried. For 3 nights in a row, always at 11:15 p.m., someone rang the bell and ran away. At first, I thought it was some stupid joke of neighborhood teenagers. But what bothered me was the accuracy of the time. It didn't seem like something random. On the 4th night, I decided that I would be ready. I turned off all the lights in the front of the house and sat on the couch, from where I could see the street through the curtain slit. The clock was 11:12 p.m. when I felt my heart speed up, as if my body knew it was about to happen again. At exactly 11:15 p.m., the sound of the doorbell echoed in the house. I jumped off the couch and, instead of going to the door, went straight to the window. I pulled the curtain slowly, trying not to make noise. That's when I saw something I didn't expect. A shadow, taller than anyone I knew, running towards the forest that starts just after the sidewalk. You couldn't distinguish details, just a dark contour moving quickly and strangely silently. I stood there, looking at the darkness of the forest, wondering what someone would be doing there, repeating it night after night. The next morning, I went down earlier than usual to see if I could find any clues. The grass in front was still wet with dew, and that's when I noticed something strange. Footprints, not exactly human, but not animal either, going from the gate to the base of my balcony, and then going to the woods. The marks were deep and a little elongated, as if something heavier than an ordinary person had passed there. I took pictures and sent them to a friend who works with tracking, but he said he couldn't identify for sure. I spent the whole day with that image in my head. When the night came, my anxiety was at 1,000. I turned off all the lights again and stayed in the same position as the night before, waiting. 11:15 p.m. arrived, but this time nothing. There was no bell, no shadow, no movement. I sighed with relief and moved the curtain away. That's when I noticed something on the doormat, a folded paper, slightly wet by the fog. I opened it with trembling hands. In crooked and thin letters it was written, "Today I saw you too." I took the ticket and stood still for a few seconds, trying to understand what that meant. The strangest thing is that it was dry inside, as if it had been placed there a short time ago, although the street was completely silent. I locked the door and spent the night without sleeping, mentally reviewing every detail of the last few days, trying to fit the pieces. The next morning, I checked the security cameras, hoping to find at least a figure or some movement, but there was nothing, just the video jumping for a few seconds at the exact moment the doorbell would have rung. It's as if whoever was doing this knew exactly where and how to act to not be seen. To this day, I have no idea who or what it was. All I know is that, since then, I avoid looking at the woods when I go through the window. It started on an ordinary night, when I was lying in bed, rolling on my cell phone before going to sleep. The building where I live is old, so noises through the walls were nothing new to me, plumbing, neighbors talking, things like that. But that night, the sound was different. A low, continuous murmur, almost as if someone was leaning on the other side of the wall, saying something I couldn't understand properly. I thought it was a neighbor on the phone, until I realized that the tone was more directed. I turned off my cell phone and was silent, trying to identify the words. That's when I heard clearly my name, said in a dragged way, almost a child's whisper. My whole body got goosebumps at the time. I was paralyzed, still trying to convince myself that it was a coincidence, but then other words came, describing exactly what I was doing. Lying down, with my eyes open, holding the cell phone in my right hand. I couldn't move. It was as if each syllable preached me more in bed. I got up slowly, without making noise, and brought my ear closer to the wall. The whispers continued, but now they were faster, as if the person was describing my every step in real time. Lifting, touching the wall, breathing faster. My heart raced. I thought about hitting the wall, but something told me not to do that. The idea of showing that I was listening seemed dangerous. I took a few steps back and picked up the phone to call the concierge, but before I could dial, the whisper changed tone. He was no longer just describing, he started saying things like, "Don't look back," and "They're here." My breathing became heavy, and I felt that cold heat rise up the back of my neck, as if someone was standing exactly behind me. I turned into a reflection, and the room was empty, but the whisper on the other side of the wall began to laugh. I couldn't stay in that room anymore. I went to the living room, trying to convince myself that it was some neighbor playing, or maybe a sound coming from the pipes, but the laughter didn't stop. On the contrary, he seemed to follow in my footsteps. When I got close to the living room wall, he was also there, whispering my name again, only this time lower, almost a murmur that forced my ear to get closer. I took the keys, decided to leave the apartment, but before opening the door, I heard something that made my hands tremble. "You'll be back soon, won't you?" It was the same voice, but this time sounding as if it were inside my own head. I left without looking back, and until today I could never sleep in that room. Even so, sometimes, when I come home at night, I have the impression that I still hear someone calling my name through the walls. I've never been the type to be impressed with strange stories or supernatural things. I've always been very skeptical even. But there was a night, in my own apartment, that I still can't explain, and thinking about it still gives me chills. It was an ordinary day. I had just arrived from work, around 10 p.m., and I was just wanting to take a shower and lie down. While going from the bedroom to the kitchen, I passed through the narrow corridor that connects the two rooms, and that's where there is a large mirror stuck on the right wall. This mirror always reflected part of the corridor, and in the background, the entrance to the room. At the time, I quickly looked at the reflection, and something caught my attention. It wasn't very evident at first, but it bothered me enough for me to stop and take a step back. In the reflection, the room looked different. I could clearly see an armchair that was in the corner, but this time there was something dark, low, as if it were a person sitting in it. But there was no one in my room. I stared for a few seconds, trying to understand if it was shadow, lighting, anything logical, but when I turned my head to face the real room, the armchair was empty. My first thought was that it was a distorted reflection, perhaps caused by the lighting of the kitchen and the living room at the same time. But when I looked at the mirror again, the figure was still there, sitting motionless, slightly turned to the corridor. The most disturbing thing is that there was no clear detail of face or clothing, just a dark, compact silhouette, which contrasted with the rest of the environment. My breathing began to speed up, and I realized that I was leaning forward, as if I wanted to confirm every detail. I decided to do a test. I walked slowly into the room, looking around, trying to see if something on the floor or in the furniture could be creating that shape in the reflection. Normal light, furniture in the same places, absolute silence. But when I looked at the mirror again, from where it was already inside the room, there was nothing else strange in the reflection. That left me with a weird feeling, as if I had just missed an important test of something I didn't want to believe. I tried to convince myself that I was tired, maybe even sleepy, and that my brain was just playing tricks. I went to the kitchen to get a glass of water, but I couldn't help but glance at the mirror in the hallway. This time, the reflection seemed normal, until I realized a detail. The chair that in the real world was leaning against the table appeared, in the reflection, slightly away, as if someone had just gotten up. A chill went up my back, and the feeling that I wasn't alone took over me. With my heart racing, I walked to the real chair, and of course, it was in the right place, leaning. But fear had already taken on proportions greater than logic. I moved the chair away slowly and stood there, waiting to hear some sound that indicated the presence of another person. The silence was so dense that any minimal noise would make me jump. I decided not to face the mirror anymore and locked myself in the room, with the door closed and the light on, but that feeling that the figure was still there in the reflection didn't let me sleep. I tried to spend the rest of the night in the room, but the paranoia didn't let me. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined what would happen if, for some reason, the reflex decided to move on its own. Around 3 in the morning, I gathered courage and went out to go to the bathroom. I avoided looking at the mirror as much as possible, but on the way back, I ended up giving in and cast a quick corner look. The blood frosted. In the reflection, the corridor looked exactly the same, except for a shadow stopped at the entrance of the kitchen. It was as if he was watching me, motionless, without a face, just the silhouette. I immediately tired the body, but the entrance was empty. When I looked at the mirror again, the shadow was no longer there. Since that night, I avoid going through that corridor in the dark, and until today, I have never faced that mirror for more than a second. That night, I was alone at home. It was almost 2 in the morning, and I had just finished a movie. The silence was so heavy that I could hear the noise of my own heart. I got out of bed determined to go drink a glass of water, but when I got close to the bedroom door, something made me stop. A low, rhythmic sound breathing. It wasn't mine, it was deeper, heavier, almost panting, coming from the other side of the door. My body crashed. For a few seconds, I stood there, just trying to confirm if it was real. I tilted my head closer to the wood, and felt that the sound was clearer, as if the person was inches away. It wasn't a distant noise or an echo, it was there, right behind the door. My mind began to run, trying to remember if I had really locked all the doors of the house earlier. I took a deep breath, took courage, and opened the door in a quick movement, hoping to find someone in the hallway. But there was nothing. The corridor was dark and empty, only the weak light of the kitchen partially illuminating the end of it. But the sound continued. I could hear the breath, still strong and irregular, but now it seemed to come from somewhere ahead, maybe from the room. I started walking slowly, with my feet almost dragging so as not to make noise, trying to identify the exact direction of the sound. At every step, he seemed to move too, as if he was retreating. When I got to the room, there was no one, but the back door was slightly open, something of a couple of fingers. I was absolutely sure that I had closed and locked it before going to sleep. I held the back door handle, but before closing it, I realized that my breath had suddenly stopped. The silence that followed was so absolute that my ears came to buzz. It was at that moment that I noticed something on the sill, a shoe mark, large, printed in dust and moisture, pointing inside the house. I closed and locked the door immediately, feeling my heart speed up even more. I went back to the room trying to think about what to do, but as soon as I put my hand on the doorknob in my room, my breath came back, exactly behind me, as if the person was leaning against my neck. I was coming home on a Tuesday night. The street was almost deserted, illuminated only by a few spaced poles and by the weak light of closed windows. The sound of my steps echoed on the wet asphalt, creating that silence that, instead of calming down, makes everything heavier. That's when I realized that there was another sound along with mine. They seemed to come from behind, keeping exactly the same rhythm. I would stop, and they would. I would walk again, and they started again. It wasn't a coincidence. I looked over my shoulder quickly, trying not to look nervous. The sidewalk behind me was empty. No people, no car passing by, nothing that could justify that sound. I kept walking, but now paying attention to every detail around me. My heart was beating faster, and the sound of the steps behind me seemed louder and louder. The feeling was that, with each step, the distance decreased. That's when I looked across the street, I saw a man standing. He didn't walk. He was just there, motionless, with his hands in his pockets, watching. Even from a distance, it seemed that his eyes were fixed on me. I couldn't identify his face because of the shadow cast by a nearby tree, but he didn't seem rushed or interested in disguising. He remained still while I kept walking, which only made everything more confusing. I looked back again. The sidewalk was still empty, but the sound of the steps continued. I come up close, very close, as if someone was a few meters away from me. It was impossible to understand from where. I crossed to the opposite side of the street, in an attempt to increase the distance of the standing man. It was at that moment that I realized that he also started to walk, keeping the same speed as me. It wasn't fast, but constant, as if he had all the time in the world to follow me. I tried to rationalize. Maybe it was just someone going the same way as me. But instinct said no. Something in his posture, and the way he didn't look away, made me sure it wasn't a coincidence. I accelerated the pace. The sound behind me accelerated too. The man across the street did the same. Now, I felt like I was being followed by two places at the same time, but I couldn't see anyone on my own sidewalk. I turned on my street quickly, hoping it would give me some relief. But when I looked back, I saw the man standing on the corner, watching me motionless as before. The sound of footsteps on the sidewalk disappeared along with him. I entered the house, locking the door in a hurry. I waited a few minutes before looking out the window. The street was empty. Even so, I spent the night with the feeling that, at some point, those steps would accompany me again.